All right. Thank you all so much. I hope you had a good lunch. Again, I'm Amherst Williams with the Connecticut League of Museums. And I am so pleased to introduce our next presenter. I want to say a little bit about sort of the origins of bringing John and the folks from the Freedom Trail here today. One of the great joys of my work is that I get to meet with a lot of different people around the state, representing a lot of different organizations. And one of the most exciting meetings that I go to on a monthly basis is the meeting of the Connecticut Freedom Trail. How many of you are familiar with the Freedom Trail? Good, most of you. So as you know, this is an organization of sites related to African American history across the state of Connecticut. And one of the things that's most interesting about the Freedom Trail is that it encompasses a lot of different types of sites, as well as different kinds of organizations. Everything from privately owned homes to museums and things like the Bassett Hall on the CCSU campus. The Freedom Trail is, sort of organized by the state of Connecticut and has a wonderful staff supporting it, including Todd Levine and Tammy Denise, but is really reliant on a network of people across the state. And one of the most exciting things that I've been involved with lately and feel so honored to have become a part of is an initiative that we'll be talking a little bit about this afternoon, and that is the Freedom Trail's Black Narratives Committee. Sally Whipple and I both were talking yesterday about how fun it is to be able to go to these meetings and what an engaging group of people it is. So I am not the person to tell you all about it, but the person who is here to share a bit more about what I think is the exciting work that is happening at the Connecticut Freedom Trail is John Mills. John Mills is originally from San Diego and is a trained genealogist, independent scholar, descendant of the enslaved, and founder of the Alex Brienne Corporation, a Connecticut-based nonprofit. Alex Brienne Corporation focuses on research, interrogation, and presentation of lesser-known stories representing the life experiences of the American enslaved, presented from an African-American perspective. John focuses on unearthing little-known people of color and injecting them into the communities where they lived, worked, or died. And John's goal is to honor the forgotten as well as to apply critical thinking to our history as a means to find solutions to many ripple effects today. And I think we heard similar strains in Professor Lennox's talk before the break. And I hope that these are threads that we can pick up in some of our breakout conversations this afternoon. So without further ado, I want to hand things over to John Mills.
All right, I got the clicker here, right?
Yep.
All right, I'll be good. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate that. It's interesting the question you asked about who's familiar with the Connecticut Freedom Trail, and I got like 3 or 4 slides to tell you what it is, and you guys already know what the Freedom Trail is. So, but I'm still going to go through them. I'm still going to go through them anyway. So the Connecticut Freedom Trail was established in August of 1995 by Al Motter, who was a member of the Amistad Committee, which was a nonprofit out of New Haven at the time, in a collaboration with Senator Tony Harp. They worked with the General Assembly to make the Connecticut Freedom Trail a law. It opened in September of 1996 with 60 sites across 30 towns. It tells the struggle for freedom for the Black and African American community. The goal is to have at least one site in all 169 Connecticut municipalities. Today there are 170 plus sites, a little more than 170, across 70 different towns. And sites are like categorized. So they're like, you're either aligned to topics relative to the Underground Railroad, to the Amistad, to civil rights, or more generally, concepts of freedom. And there's a process that you must go through at ctfreedomtrail.org to then be able to submit, and then once approved by a committee of individuals who are already on the Freedom Trail, you are then presented with a plaque and a flag for display within your site. And again, the site is ctfreedomtrail.org, and they just recently released a new website. The website just went up within weeks. I don't remember the date. So it's much cleaner than the one prior. They're still kind of working some things out, but the hope is that at some point, people from here and around who come and travel to Connecticut will have some place to go to know where these specific sites are around the state that they can go and visit and learn more about some of the stories relative to the African American experience in Connecticut. We recognized last year that we had some specific challenges with regards to some of our sites. Those being that certain sites were not sharing African American content. So they're on the trail relative to something related to the African American experience, but if you go there, there's no content to tell you anything about that. Some sites were unsure of how they should be presenting that content, which was the reason why they weren't. They weren't sure how to do that. There were other sites that were presenting inconsistent narratives, right? So somewhere else they might tell a narrative that more aligns to what the African American community might see fit. And within their site is something in contrast to that. Sites, some had no African American people with providing any input to that narrative. And then because of all of these things, some sites were requesting support. Like they were recognizing, like we don't know, like, help us out, how do we do this? And so that was the ultimate birth of the Black Narrative Subcommittee, a subcommittee of the Connecticut Freedom Trail Committee. Again, the overall committee are individuals representing each of the sites on the Freedom Trail. And so this is a subcommittee of the overall committee. But we quickly established a mission with regards to this, like let's help the sites out. And that mission, roughly, was to establish standards, guardrails, a glossary of acceptable and unacceptable terms, and learning opportunities for use in understanding, developing, and presenting Black and African American narratives. So that's what we want to do, right? We're like, this is our mission. We had some early meetings. This all started mid to late last year. But we immediately recognized we had some questions, right? Like, who should be telling Black narratives? Like, is there some defined kind of pattern or people, or who should be doing that? What terminology should or shouldn't be used and why? How do we establish and disseminate standards and literature? Like how do we do that? And who should provide input? Should it just be us? Like, are we qualified to do that? Who presents input to this? And then after we develop whatever we develop, who should vet it? Like, who do we contact to ensure that our patterns, our processes are well thought out and aligned? And then, are there already established standards and literature? Like, were we reinventing the wheel? Do we just not know that there's something out there and we've got to find it, right? And so we started doing some digging. This is where we are now, doing that digging to figure out, does something exist? Should we be pairing with something else? We did find a few things, one of which was author Dr. P. Gabriel Foreman. On her website, she establishes some guardrails. She has a document, like a pamphlet, that she produced along with some of her colleagues and counterparts. And she provides it for free as long as you cite it, and you can get it at pgabrielforeman.com. Within her documentation, she has like these categories of which underneath each has more detail about what you should or shouldn't be doing, where you should or shouldn't get more additional information, how you should or shouldn't be considering certain narratives. The first category is language to consider adopting and preferred terms. The second category is language to consider avoiding. The third category is principles to consider as you're like building out these narratives. The fourth is principles you should adopt. And then the fifth are literature that her and her colleagues used in coming up with the individual elements under each of those previous categories. So that you can go, she's referencing them, she's saying you can go here, you can learn more, and get additional information. And so I found that incredibly useful. Like, actually I referenced it after creating this deck, and then went, I shouldn't have put that word in there, but I already made the deck, right? So, so yeah, it's been incredibly helpful. As it relates to the 250, I think the narrative and having the appropriate narrative and the appropriate context in your heritage and museum sites is incredibly important. I think it can create a sense of belonging and power and pride, or it can inject a sense of displacement, depending on how and if you do it. And so in order to kind of talk to that, the narrative and how that can work and what that can mean if you do it right or don't, I thought I would just talk about my own story. Right? I thought that would be a little more powerful than just words from someone else. So, as Amber said, I'm originally from San Diego, born and raised, child of father who was in Vietnam, who came back and was a part of the time in California. He was a part of those messages around the Black Panthers and the US organization and what they were saying. And he was adamant about ensuring that I recognized my value. And so everything he talked about was very strong towards that. It's interesting, this is my father in the upper left, very fair-skinned. It's funny, most of my life my family would talk about, that's because there's Native American in our family. We would eventually figure out that that's Irish. That's not Native American. That's Irish. That ain't Native American. But he experienced racism from both sides. We were raised in a black community. I mean, he got it from African Americans. He got it from white America. He grew up in the 40s and 50s. He got it from both sides. I heard Terry talking earlier about, I was around in 1976. I remember that. I was around in 1976 too, Terry. I'm glad you said it. I was about to say I wasn't as old as Terry. I'm sorry, yeah. I'm glad you said it. Yeah, I wasn't in the gas, I was in the back seat. But what I remember from 1976, really is what I remember most, is the quarter with the drummer on the back. I get one of those quarters. You didn't want to spend it. That's what I remember. But what I also remember from 1976 is me and my sister, we were latchkey kids, and in the summer, a woman babysat us down the street. She's like the neighborhood babysitter. And so we would have to walk. My mom would be off to work, and we would have to walk down the street to get to the babysitter's house. And we would get there, and she wouldn't let us in the house. She would force us to stay on the patio. But the white children were in the house. And so we'd spend all day with them like teasing us for not being able to go in the house. Right? And we were so young, we didn't say anything about it. And eventually, I tell my mother, just happenstancely, and then of course, she lays into this person and we never go there again. I'm telling you this story, and I'll probably tell you others, because how I tell a narrative is informed by my life experience. And how I interpret and determine how I celebrate the 250th is also informed by that life experience. It's not lost on me that as I look around this room, I can count the African Americans on one hand, right? And I don't think that's coincidental. And I think narratives come to play with regards to that. Years later, a friend of mine, his name was Gary Tompkins. I was like in the 3rd or 4th grade, and he's like, let's go over to my house for lunch. And I'm like, yeah, let's go. We go to his house, and I could tell his father was a little odd to me. It felt uncomfortable. And he tells his father, I brought Johnny home for lunch. And his father looks at me and says, yo, so you want watermelon? But as a kid, it meant nothing. Again, it meant nothing. As an adult, I can reflect back and go, wow, where was I living, right? I don't think my community was odd. Those experiences would continue. It would continue into housing. In '89, me and my wife were trying to rent a place. We did it all over the phone. Person was all excited. We had our check ready. We just had to go down there to sign. We get there, and we hear her in the back, and the bell rang because we walked in the door. She said, Mr. Mills, I'm on my way out. As she comes out, she sees us, and she tells us the room is no longer available. And that would continue into healthcare. In '95, my wife was told over and over that her pain was being dismissed. That's a stomach ache. That's not that bad. The doctor finally came to me one day and said, is she just low tolerance for pain? Eventually, I came home from work to find her passed out. She had a bowel obstruction, and I had to call 911, got her to the hospital. She was in a room with another African-American woman who was also having surgery for a bowel obstruction. I go to work. When I come back to the hospital the next day, the woman next to her had passed away. They both had the same condition. These are the series of these things. Into corporate America, I had him in corporate America. I had a manager ask me how come he couldn't call me the N-word. Like, it just continued all of my life. So, and it has never stopped. These microaggressions and unconscious bias elements and racist things, it's just continued my entire life. And so, on the left, that's my family. That's my wife on the upper right. That's Erica Anastasia. My daughter in the middle there, she's 35. That's Jasmine Marie. To her left is my 26-year-old. That's Andrea Yasmin. And on the far left, that's my youngest. That's Alex Brienne, the namesake of my nonprofit. And someday I'll tell you guys, that's a long story why that's, it's named after her. My sister started in the late 90s to start to do genealogy. And genealogy helped me get to this place of how do I take my narrative and present it in a way that can affect those things I just talked about in their lives, right? Specifically because all of those experiences impacted me. They had me not have a sense of pride of self. And I recognized that in the early 90s. Even though I had a father that was trying to tell me not to get there, it still happened. I still saw white America as greater than me. And I prescribed that that was because all of those microaggressions, all those racist things, I think that's what happened. And I didn't want that to happen to them. I was trying to figure out how to do that. Genealogy got me there. My sister told me about my second great grandfather. His name was Ned Mills. He was enslaved in Texas. I knew my grandfather, Mylon Mills. He died in 1987. He never talked about living in Texas. I never knew anything about that. I thought, God just dropped him on the earth. He had no siblings or parents. I didn't know anything. But I learned through my sister that he was chased out of Texas in the 30s. He's being threatened to be hung because he was in an interracial relationship. And he never went back. So, which is why we were in San Diego. He's a part of the Great Migration, but he's a part of the Great Migration due to trauma. And so because of that, in the 90s, my sister's doing this research, and we learned about my second great grandfather, Ned Mills. We also learned about his mother Eliza Mills, who died in 1918 in the flu pandemic. And my sister shows me the death certificate, and sure enough, she died in the flu pandemic. This is the first time I'd ever even seen a picture of anybody related to my grandfather other than his sons and daughter. So we decided to go to East Texas because it said right on there that she's buried at Hickory Grove Cemetery in Henderson, Texas. So we fly there in 2003. Ironically, on 4th of July, 2003, we walked through that cemetery there. They were buried in the woods. If you see over my shoulder in the picture on the right, that's the front, which is the whites only cemetery of Hickory Grove Cemetery. It was a very odd experience walking past a pristine kept cemetery, envisioning that your ancestors took this exact same walk, looking at privilege while they walked into the woods. It was very odd. It's never left me. On the right, we went back in 2022 because we took my father, because we wanted him to meet people he had never met. So we introduced him to his first cousins. That was also an experience that I'll never forget. They gave us a picture. They gave us this picture of my grand aunts, my grandfather's sisters. They also had pictures of me, by the way. I'm like, how do you get a picture of me? I guess my grandfather was sending stuff home. But they gave us this picture, and it's a very eerie picture for me. Yeah, that's my Aunt Mamie, Roberta, Elizabeth, and Eula May. Roberta in the upper left was 11 years old when her mother died in 1918. She was the person who reported her mother's death. Their father died in 1915, so they were parentless at that point, and they were raised by their brothers. This picture was taken in the early 1920s. So at the time, similar to today, they were preparing for an anniversary of this country as well, right? 1926 was coming up. They were preparing for the 150th. And every time I look at this picture as it relates to this story, I think, what were their thoughts on this country, right, when this picture was being taken? If I asked them about it, what would they have said? What would have their life experience informed them of how they should see it? My sister also talked to me about my father's mother, who died in 1998. Again, I knew her well as well. The most interesting thing about her genealogy is in the upper right, which would be my third great grandmother, Marguerite, which then answers this question of the light skin of my father. She was enslaved by Keziah and John White, Irish immigrants, who purchased her, and then John raped her. And so that dissension is what then comes to my father and me, which, again, based on my sister's research, then tells the story of his fair skin and a few of his brothers' fair skin. Introducing this information to my father, it didn't go all that. He didn't say a lot, but I could tell I don't know how comfortable he was with it. He's such a prideful African-American man, right? Also in the upper left is my third great grandfather, Sam Kyle. Same thing, he was the product of the same situation. We decided to go find out where they were, and it was the same scenario. I'm standing at the enslaver's gravestone, but over my shoulder is the woods where I found my ancestors. Again, like these experiences that hit your chest that then inform how you read documentation, what pops off the page when you read it. This is my mother's father, John Smith. I knew him, heavy naval guy, died in 2007. My sister discovered after he had passed that his great-grandfather was also in the Navy. He never knew that. He would have been ecstatic had he known that. I wish we could have told him. But he was also in the Navy, and he fought in the Civil War. Fought on 4 separate ships. When he died, he was buried at Laurel Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland, which was a historic African-American cemetery. But in 1957, Laurel Cemetery was paved over to make a parking lot. And so there's some 30,000 to 35,000 estimated African-Americans buried under that parking lot. So me and my sister went to visit that. Again, another one of those moments where you're standing there and thinking about value, like their value to this particular society, and marrying that with my own experiences, and marrying, coming to the place of how do people see me? What was my value to this society? And ultimately coming to the conclusion that mine was less, and then having to like interrogate that later in life. Those are the things that inform how I interrogate documentation, and those are the things that inform the narratives that I tell when I'm looking at the stories of the African American experience, which may be completely different than other genealogists and historians. And I was able to find elements of where that was so. I was reading this book from 3 years ago. It's by this guy named Dennis Caron. He's writing about this enslaved man in Middletown who was brought here from Guinea in the 1730s as a kid. And he was eventually sold to a man named Philip Mortimer in Middletown, and he worked on Philip Mortimer's rope walk. And his book was based on an 1844 book. So he writes this in 2006, but his book was based on this 1844 book about Newgate Prison in East Granby. And that book just had this blurb, like 2 small paragraphs about this same enslaved man. And in that paragraph, it's because it's summarizing. It's like, yeah, he's from Guinea. He comes over here in a dirty slave ship. He's like dark as night. He gets sold to, this guy in Middletown. He starts making rope for this guy. Eventually, he tries to poison the enslavers to get his freedom. He fought. He was a servant to many officers in the Revolutionary War. Once he's in prison, he dies at 110 years old. And so Dennis Caron's book is like based on that book, but he's trying to like fill in all these gaps. But what I found like incredibly interesting about his book is he at the very front in the preface, he says, he's talking about that passage in that book in 1844, and he said, frankly, this passage did not make any particular impression on me. At this first reading, the appeal of Prince's story struck me only after I reflected over the dates that Phelps mentions. Prince died in 1834 at the stated age of 110. And when I read that in Dennis Caron's book, after reading the 1844 book, I'm like, that's what you got out of this, that he was 110? Because what I got out of it was like, where is he buried? I just walked through 3 places and there were no cemeteries for my own family. What I got out of it was colorism. They talked about he was dark as night, and I had all these experiences of my father and colorism affecting him. So as I'm reading it, that's what hit me right in the face. I was thinking about the trauma that I'd heard about my grandfather, and then as he talked about this trauma of being taken from his family and coming over here on this dirty slave ship. I was thinking about the lack of documentation, like it's so limited. Just like it's limited to find my furthest enslaved Mills, Ned Mills. I'm thinking about where's the details of who he really was. I'm thinking about criminal justice inequality, because once I read the book, I realized he was sent to prison at 87 on an accusation after he was promised freedom twice. And now the narrative is he's just a criminal. And so I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about how generational wealth relative to the family that imprisoned him played a role in this. If you know the story, they were trying to maintain wealth, which is why he was never freed. Inequities in healthcare. I found out while he was at Wethersfield Prison, he was in hospital for like a year because the prison warden was taking all the food for his family and they were feeding them spoiled food. So the doctors kept saying, just feed him better food. But because they wouldn't, he was constantly in the hospital. I was seeing inequities in medical research, and that came from determining that he actually was never buried. It looks like his body was sent to Yale after he passed. So there's just a lot more that pop off the page for me than just that he was 110. And those are scenarios where I think how the narrative is told and who's telling the narrative and what was their life experience and what informs it plays a role in how that's told. This is another individual, or that same thing applied. This guy's name is Isaac J. Hill. He's from Pennsylvania. He came to Connecticut strictly because during the Civil War, Connecticut wanted, they needed enlistments, and they were raising a colored regiment. So he's like, wait a minute, they're gonna let me fight? He was in the Pennsylvania 6th, and they wouldn't, he was just digging trenches. So they're gonna let me fight? So he races to Connecticut to fight here, and he survives the war, the Civil War. He goes back and lives out his life in New Jersey. He writes a book in 1866, and that book many people reference. I know Chris Barlow talked yesterday. His 15-minute documentary is based on Isaac J. Hill's book. As I dug into the story, I found out that when he passed away in 1882, he was buried in Red Bank Cemetery, because my first question was, where is he? Because of my own experiences with my own family. I found out he was buried in Red Bank Cemetery in Woodbury, New Jersey, so I went to check that out, and I found out that that doesn't exist anymore. It was paved over for the parking lot for the Innsborough Medical Center in 1962. And so the stones that were there were moved like a mile away to another cemetery, and they're lined up against a fence at the back of the cemetery, which, again, another story that aligned really well to what I had seen. More that now informs how I interrogate information. Within his book, though, which I found incredibly interesting, is a couple of things that I've never heard. He talks about how before deploying from New Haven, he talks about how the 29th was not paid their bounty. And because they were not paid their bounty, they refused to acknowledge the flag. Now, I've seen a lot of people talk about his book. I've never seen anybody mention that. That jumps right off the page when what? I mean, I've heard that from like the '68 Olympics. You know, I've heard Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf did something like that in the NBA in the early '90s, and then he got banished. I heard about Colin Kaepernick. I didn't know our own Connecticut 29th Regiment did the exact same thing in 1864. That pops off the page. He also talks about they're in Texas and they're sailing back to Connecticut. Civil War is over. They're sailing back to Connecticut. They stop off in New York, and the next stop is Hartford. And he says in his book that the guys weren't all that happy about coming back to Connecticut because Connecticut hadn't given them their rights. Now, if you know what he's talking about there, this is November of 1865. In October of 1865, it was put up for vote in the state of Connecticut to remove the word white from a requirement to vote in our state constitution. And Connecticut voted that down. They were like, leave the word white in there. And so they knew that while they were out and about and coming back to Connecticut. They knew that. And so he's kind of giving you reference in his book that we weren't happy with Connecticut coming back here. That pops off the page. I've never heard anybody mention that. It pops right off the page for me. And so kind of to round this out, I think reviewing the information with regards to my own family, reviewing this documentation from these individuals gave me an incredible reverence for these people. It turned them into heroes for me. Like they were like, it's like running, like if someone told you they ran a marathon. I mean, I never run a marathon, so I don't get the gravity of that. But if they tell you about the 6 months of waking up at 4 a.m., and they tell you about all the blisters that they got, they tell you about falling and all the scrapes and scuffs that they had, and if they tell you about the dehydration, they tell you about all the pain, then you can recognize the gravity of that greatness. If we don't tell the full story about these people, you leave me unable to feel their level of greatness. So I encourage anyone who's responsible for a heritage site, a museum, to tell the full story so the African American community can have that level of reverence. I often hear folks say, well, that's too painful. Why would we want to tell that? For me, it was exalting of who they were. And so please continue to do that. I had another slide, but I'm going to skip past it. I know we're short on time. If you want any additional information about my nonprofit, you can go to alexburian.org. Again, we've got a lot of projects going on around the state, specifically to find these stories, interrogate them. I'm a trained genealogist, so we do that, and then we drive ways to like instill and install them into the community, whether it be a street name change, whether it be a mural, whatever it is, so that we can exalt the stories of people that are not necessarily the exceptionalists. You know, I'm not related to Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King. I'm trying to exalt what I saw as greatness, which was the everyday person. On that 1 in a million equation, I'm trying to exalt the million and what was so great about those individuals. So yeah, if you have a chance, you go to the website and check out what we do. And with that, thanks for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, John. Allison, do you think we have time for a couple of questions? Or? Okay. If you're cool with it. Please raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic.
Thank you so much. I was really, really moved by your story, John. I'm just wondering, I asked this question yesterday, and I felt the need to ask it today to you. I'm coming from Stanley Whitman House, a colonial history museum in Farmington. As an 18th century colonial museum, are there any recommendations you have for telling these stories of the African American community? Rather than just focusing, we really try to tell the stories of enslaved individuals, but overall, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what a small museum could do in really doing these stories justice.
It's interesting you asked that question, because there's like one of the slides that I just like skipped over was a project that I did that I was a part of in Deerfield, Massachusetts. Same thing. It was a colonial individual, a reverend, and that's now a museum, and they tend to tell the colonialist kind of aspect of that museum. And I worked with an international group of folks that we set up skits within the space so that we could tell the story of the African American experience and make it feel real. So we were like dressed in colonial clothing, and it was interactive so that people could ask us questions, and we talked of the time. We also presented documentation for them so that they got a better perspective of what was around them in the room that also related to the triangular trade. Like there's something they highlighted right in the room, which was this mahogany desk on their tour. But the way we described it, the mahogany desk, was to inject in what that meant and how that was a part of the economy of the time. Like, I think, I know the first is probably a little out there for a small museum, but I think relative to the artifacts that you have there, I think maybe you can inject that into the story.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful.
I thought I saw one.
Thank you. At the start of your talk, you said you looked around the audience and saw maybe 5 African Americans. I wonder what you think are the reasons why there are so few African Americans here and in similar kinds of gatherings.
Okay, so this is John Mills's opinion and John Mills's opinion only. I gotta give like a disclaimer. I don't want the Freedom Trail coming down on me. Goodness gracious. I don't need that kind of heat now. They got 170 sites. I've never really had much interest in history, if I'm honest. I don't think I'm unusual. I think there's a lot of people from the communities I came from that didn't have a lot of interest in history. You know why I think they didn't have a lot of interest in history? Because history didn't show them in a good light. History didn't show the story appropriately. History didn't give them the details. It was missing stuff. There were gaps. The components of our history left things out, didn't document people. So they don't have the same depth relative to their own genealogy. And I think all of those aspects of who we are as America, I think, play a role in there being a lack of African Americans within the community, whether it be historians or genealogists. I think all of that plays a role. I also think that, as we talked about in the beginning, everything that I do is informed by my life experience. And when I think about 1976, I don't think about, it being a memorial for America. I think about that woman who wouldn't let me walk in her house. So I think there's a lot of them African Americans that have had microaggressions and racism throughout their life. So now they're challenged with balancing that with the celebration of the 250th. So I think all of that plays a role. Again, those are John Mills's words and John Mills's words only. Yes, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was such an amazing presentation.
I appreciate it.
With that question in mind and that, I think, very poignant answer, what can we do to encourage more cooperation? I love the beginning of your presentation because you map out for us how we can go about doing some things, which I think is incredibly important. But what else can we do?
Yeah, the core thing, which is what was in the presentation and what we kind of talked about already, to me, is I think there's this dynamic that we see as contradictory, which is if you tell this full thing, who would want to hear that because that's so dark? But if we don't, we're not telling the full story. I think there's this conflict and contradiction that in and of itself creates a dilemma. And in my experience, again, learning the true path that the people I was related to truly had to walk, the good and the bad, exalted them. Like, they became heroic figures that, because they were able to endure all of that, is the only reason I'm standing here today. Like, had they not been able to endure that, I wouldn't be here. So now they become heroic. If you tell that story, you tell it truthfully within your spaces, I think other African Americans will feel the same way. And I think they'll feel a sense of alignment to us celebrating this entire union. But as long as you try to find, whether you're an advocate or not, whether you find yourself and you describe yourself, as a proponent or not, if you're struggling with that dilemma, and or if you haven't self-interrogated your own unconscious biases, thus they're creating that in your spaces, I think you're innately creating the problem that we see in the audience today. That would be my answer.
Thank you, John. I mean, I think, just speaking with my commissioner hat on, these are conversations that we've been having in my subcommittee. We have this conversation in my subcommittee pretty much every time we meet. We meet monthly.
Yes.
And, so I think that one of the things that I've really come to think a lot about is the way that the entire celebration is structured around it being this particular anniversary leads to a problem in who innately feels welcome and who may not feel like that's for them. And I think that that's a challenge the Commission and all of our sites have to overcome, that's kind of baked into the cake with it being the 250th. But I think, as Jefferson's talk showed us earlier, there are ways of taking that. I think of a presentation I went to at the New England Museum Association conference last year. And it was Gloucester, Massachusetts' 400th anniversary. And the Cape Ann Museum there worked with an indigenous production company to do an exhibit about the history of Gloucester to kind of coincide with the town's 400th anniversary. And one of the moves that the town made was they added a plus sign to the end of that 400. They said Gloucester 400 plus. And that move signaled something, particularly to groups who had been there before. The town of Gloucester had been founded, right? You know, I think back to Jeffers' slide, you know, Canada 150, think back at 13,000, right?
Right.
That maybe moves like that. That's how I kind of changed my thinking about the 250th, is this is America 250 plus. And that's just something that I'm trying to do to grapple with it. But I think that there are moves that we can make that are small, but that create that space for belonging, and that indicate this isn't just the bicentennial.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let's give it up for John again.
Thank you so much.